Good afternoon. This is Divya Talesra reporting live from the Throwback Thursday News Network. Today, we are coming to you straight from the newsroom discussing the recovery of the Great Depression and the New Deal proposed by President Roosevelt. In the 1930s, the nation seemed to be mentally exhausted. In 1929, the stock markets crashed and the Great Depression struck the people of our nation, marking the end of the Roaring Twenties. Black Thursday hit and Black Tuesday followed, pushing the country into a tailspin for the next decade. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 after Hoover's fruitless attempts to stabilize the economy. The Great Depression knocked on the door of America, an uninvited guest that brought a +1 of despair and poverty along with it. The entire nation disheartened and hopeless. The New Deal allows the federal government to play an increasingly vital role in the lives of us Americans. Political analyst Michael Barone says, the New Deal changed American life by changing the relationship between Americans and their government.
The New Deal significantly altered the lives and culture of those in the West. The construction of dams and other public work projects expanded as the influence of federal agencies became more and more powerful. These federally managed projects gave the federal government an important role in the West. The control of water ultimately meant the control of the region's future. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation, created by the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, is known for its creation of great dams and power plants. The West, generally very arid and dry, benefited from these developments as they allowed for new areas for agriculture and expansion of western cities. For example, the Boulder Dam controls the Colorado River and uses hydroelectric power to produce electricity. Electricity attracted industries to the region. Agriculture production significantly increased as well, due to irrigation canals and federal help to recover from the Dust Bowl. During the 1930s, also known as the Dirty 30s, the West suffered when the Dust Bowl, a period of severe dust storms caused by drought and soil erosion, struck. To preclude crop and livestock prices from falling further, federal programs are working to limit agricultural production. 8 million cattle were bought from farmers and were transported out of the West to prevent overgrazing, and the Taylor Grazing Act supported these measures. These reductions of livestock also affected Native Americans, the poorest group in the nation, who were plagued with epidemics and suffered from malnutrition. The Navajo economy was destroyed when the federal government reduced the size of sheep herds, disregarding the fact that their land was federally protected. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, created to manage the lands of Native Americans, was often riddled with corruption. BIA forced assimilation, such as separating children from their parents, suppressing native languages, and the division of tribal land in an attempt to encourage individual land ownership for Native Americans, failed, leaving almost half of those living on the reservation in 1933 homeless. To improve the BIA and America's relationship with Native Americans, Franklin D. Roosevelt named John Collier, one of the BIA's most vocal critics and founder of the American Indian Defense Agency, the commissioner of the organization. His goal was to completely reverse the course of America's Indian policy, and his efforts received positive feedback. In 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act ended coerced assimilation of Native people and restored Indian lands to tribal ownership. It also awarded tribal governments federal recognition and helped Indian tribes regain their status as semi-sovereign nations, guaranteeing international sovereignty. Although the Indian Recognition Act, based on the romantic notions of authentic Indian culture, helped the Indian people, not all Indians, such as Navajos, supported it. Despite all this, Collier had succeeded in assisting the Native Americans and commenced to amend the wrongs of the past.
The South, the nation's #1 economic problem, was plagued with severe poverty, illnesses, illiteracy, and misery. The average Southern household had a per capita income of less than half of a Western household, and thus was becoming a strain on the already burdened economy.
Roosevelt's largest intervention in the South was the Tennessee National Authority passed by Congress in his first 100 days. It mimicked the West's multi-purpose dams, but when faced with the utter poverty of the Tennessee Valley region, the TVA quickly expanded its vision to include economic development, bringing electricity to rural areas, restoring overworn farms, and fighting malaria. The TVA, despite all the help it provided poor Southerners, proved to be a monumental environmental disaster. TVA strip mining caused soil erosion, acid rain, and polluted rivers. Southern senators also became wary of the New Deal. Though their states benefited from the federal money pouring in historically, they were always suspicious of the federal government and aimed to preserve states' rights and their racial hierarchy. The poorest and least educated states of the nation were not to be integrated without setbacks. However, all in all, the New Deal began that integration and succeeded in helping some of the South's people.
Towards the end of 1938, the New Deal reform, which was on Franklin D. Roosevelt's agenda, came to a screeching halt due to labor strife, racial issues, the spread of fascism in Europe, and domestic initiatives losing ground to foreign affairs or defense.
The U.S. Supreme Court had ruled the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1935 and the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1936 both unconstitutional, which was the greatest danger that Franklin D. Roosevelt faced at that time. Moreover, his court packing plan was one of his most despicable agendas. Citing the advanced age and heavy workload of the 9 justices, Roosevelt asked Congress for authority to appoint 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. However, Congress rebelled, but ironically, justices began to vote in favor of liberal pro-New Deal rulings soon after. Sometimes referred to as the Roosevelt Recession, the economic recession lasted from 1937 to 1939. Roosevelt had always been committed to a balanced budget. In 1937, Roosevelt began to cut back on government spending while the Federal Reserve Board tightened credit. These two actions sent the economy into a nosedive, resulting in an increase in unemployment. In order to stimulate consumer demand and create jobs, Roosevelt chose deficit financing. Eventually, in 1939, the New Deal came to an end due to the start of World War II. Roosevelt further sacrificed domestic reforms in return for conservative support for the military. In the most current election of 1940, Roosevelt, a Democrat, was running for a third term after Hitler's military advances in Europe allegedly influenced him to pursue another term. Running against Republican Wendell Willkie, Roosevelt won 85% of the electoral votes and 54.8% of popular votes, which he gained mainly in the cities and the South. He won due to the support from African Americans, blue-collar workers, and ethnic groups. Though Roosevelt is wary of Hitler now, in the 1936 Olympic Games held in Germany, that certainly was not the case. Though campaigns around the world started to boycott the Games, in the end, the New York Times claimed the 11th Olympiad, putting Germany back in the fold of nations.
In another vein, the limited New Deal fell short of equality for people of color. Where local custom conflicted with the national intent, local custom won. Southern African Americans received lower relief payments and lower wages than whites from the New Deal. For instance, in Arizona, the Federal Emergency Relief Agency officials allocate relief payments by race superiority.
Conflict involving whites and blacks on a train ended with the black youth being victorious. Since the black youth won the brawl, they ejected the whites off of the freight train. Shortly after, a mob halted the train, arresting the black teenagers and placed them in the Scottsboro, Alabama jail. Additionally, this mob found 2 white women who allegedly claimed to have been raped by the black youth. It was later revealed through medical reports that the young women had made false accusations against the black youth. The case of the Scottsboro trial circulated around the country as a controversial topic with the racist tagline. The results were catastrophic. In a matter of 2 weeks, 8 of the so-called Scottsboro boys were convicted of rape, the ruling decided by an all-white jury that ultimately sentenced them to death. The 9th boy, who was 13 years old, evaded the death penalty by 1 slim vote. It seemed the case was over, but its ramifications were undying.
The Scottsboro case sparked a national outrage that spotlighted the inequities of court rulings involving blacks. The Supreme Court ruled that Alabama had disadvantaged the black youth by having an all-white jury and not providing proper legal counsel. Alabama presented new trials in which 5 of the youth were convicted, with 4 paroled and 1 escaping from prison. Though the Supreme Court intervened, ultimately, the Deep South's racial biases won the day. The New Deal couldn't help blacks any further because where they most needed the help, the state was stronger than the federal government.
In order to pass his legislative program, Roosevelt needed the support of Southern Democrats, whose racist ideals ultimately blurred any political progression. Roosevelt did not utilize his political power for the progression of the struggling African Americans, such as when he chose not to pass the anti-lynching bill. However, as the NAACP's Roy Wilkins stated, Roosevelt was not an enemy of the Negro, but he wasn't a friend either.
Despite that, nearly one-third of every African American's income depended on a WPA job. It seemed blacks were struggling to evade the inequities and injustices they faced. However, an unbiased light seemed to shine at the end of the tunnel as African Americans began to break the thick glass ceiling of racism with the help of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. The first window pane was broken when the First Lady invited renowned singer Marian Anderson to perform at the Lincoln Memorial Center on Easter Sunday, after the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let her perform at Washington's Constitution Hall. Moreover, integration appeared more amongst the poor and destitute, particularly in 1934, as black tenant farmers and poor Southern whites joined forces to create the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Up north, the militant Harlem Tenants League fought rent increases and evictions. African Americans began to have economic sit-downs, refusing to purchase goods of white merchants who refused to hire blacks, with their slogan being "Don't buy where you can't work."
Throughout America's hard times, the national popular culture played a key role in breaking down regional boundaries and fostering national connections during the 1930s. Radio, movie, and youth culture homogenized America's culture and united Americans throughout the nation. The tunes of the radio became as familiar as the crickets' chirp in the evening as their broadcast became an everlasting soundtrack that played throughout the days and nights of the Depression. With radios becoming more and more popular, manufacturers raced to make new, cheaper models, and by the end of the decade, families, on average, listened to the radio 5 hours per day. Often, struggling families would sell everything before they gave up their radios.
Roosevelt took advantage of this growing industry and spoke directly to the American people with his fireside chats, where he would update them on national issues facing the nation. These casual fireside chats not only made him more relatable, but served as a vital segue for a more personal friendship between the president and the American people. His 30-evening broadcast helped him win over the public. Along with political news and the voices of leaders, the radio offered entertainment. For children, the adventures of Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, and Flash Gordon. Soap operas also became the new fad among housewives, with titles like The New Romance of Helen Trent and Young Widow Brown. Families listened to comedies of ex-vaudevillains Jack Benny, George Burns, and Gracie Allen. The radio also transported Americans to faraway events in cities right from their own homes. The Metropolitan Opera broadcast from New York City on Saturday afternoon, and Hawaii Calls also broadcast from Mauna Hotel on Waikiki Beach. Major League Baseball games started reporting live from 1935 onward. News stories such as the kidnapping of hero Charles Lindbergh's son in 1932 and the triumphs of black boxer Joe Louis, also known as the Brown Bomber, let Americans share the same experiences and created a more collective mass culture.
Film reflected that national culture trend. In a nation of fewer than 130 million people, between 80 to 90 million movie tickets were sold weekly. Comedies were popular, and the optimism of the song Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf from Disney's Three Little Pigs was a big hit in 1933. That same year, the economy hit rock bottom. Film's power was demonstrated when undershirt sales plummeted after Clark Gable took off his shirt to reveal a bare chest in It Happened One Night. The film industry had its round of criticisms as well. Gangster movies and the glamorization of crime worried the public, and in 1934, the Roman Catholic Legion of Decency threatened to boycott the film industry. From then on, movies were made with a production code that would determine what Americans saw in the movie theater. The head of the production code administration pledged, "The vulgar, the cheap, and the tawdry is out. There is no room on the screen at any time for pictures which offend against common decency." Because of the shortage of jobs, children who would have gone to work by 14 were instead going to school. School was free, classrooms were warm, and the education seemed to promise a better future. By the end of the decade, more kids were getting educated and national youth culture grew. Young people listened to the same music, adopted the same styles of clothing, dance, and speech. The Depression caused youth culture to spread more widely among America's young generation.
As we head into a new decade, the 1940s, the lives of the American people are forever changed by the legislation of the Roosevelt administration. All over America, New Deal legislation attempted to fix the worst civil, social, and economic ailments of the Great Depression decade. It changed the government and the presidency, though the New Deal also tried helping the African Americans of the time. Racial injustices, such as the Scottsboro trial, prevailed. Throughout the hard years of the Depression, radio and film stayed strong as a way for Americans to feel connected. As dark as these times have been, though, a storm cloud brews in the distance. Both Roosevelt and the common American people are keeping their eyes on Hitler, with the strong premonition that things aren't over yet.
Thank you for watching CNN's Throwback Thursday News Network. We'll see you next month, Thursday evening, with our newest segment.